The telegram arrived at 3 a.m. Frank Sinatra was in his suite at the Ambassador East Hotel in Chicago, a cigarette burning between his fingers, a glass of bourbon untouched on the nightstand. He had been staring at the ceiling for hours, replaying the voice in his head. Her voice. The voice that had stopped him cold in a rundown jazz club 3 weeks earlier. The telegram was from his accountant. It contained 2 sentences. The velvet door is yours. The singer is gone. Frank read those words 6 times. He crushed the paper in his fist. Then he did something he rarely did. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. Outside, Chicago was sleeping. But Frank Sinatra was wide awake, trapped in a mystery he had created with his own generosity. He had bought an entire club for a woman he barely knew. And now she had vanished into the night like smoke from a dying candle. What happened in Chicago in November 1956 is one of the strangest chapters in Frank Sinatra's life. It is a story about talent, obsession, and the dangerous game of playing savior to someone who doesn't want to be saved. To understand what drove Frank to such madness, you have to understand where he was in 1956. The previous 5 years had been a resurrection. In 1951, Frank Sinatra was finished. His records weren't selling. His movies were bombing. The press called him washed up. But then came From Here to Eternity in 1953. The Oscar. The comeback. By 1956, Frank was back on top. Capitol Records was releasing hit after hit. He was filming High Society with Bing Crosby and Grace Kelly. The world was his again. But Frank carried scars from those dark years. He never forgot what it felt like to be ignored. And because of that, Frank had a weakness, a beautiful, dangerous weakness. He couldn't resist a voice in trouble. When he heard someone sing with that raw, hungry desperation, something inside him broke open. Chicago in November 1956 was a city of contrasts. The Gold Coast glittered with wealth. But a few miles south, jazz clubs clung to life like weeds growing through cracked concrete. The mob ran most of them. The musicians who played there were brilliant and broke. Frank was in Chicago for concerts at the Chez Paree. But on his second night in town, he did what he always did. He slipped away. He put on a hat, pulled up his collar, and went hunting for music. Frank found the Velvet Door on a side street in Bronzeville, the heart of Chicago's black community. The club was small, maybe 30 seats, with velvet curtains that had seen better decades and a piano that was missing 2 keys. The air was thick with smoke and something else, something electric. On the tiny stage stood a woman. She was young, maybe 25, with skin the color of coffee and cream and eyes that held a sadness Frank recognized instantly. She was singing The Man I Love, and her voice was doing things to that song that George Gershwin never imagined. It was wounded and defiant at the same time. It was the voice of someone who had been hurt, but refused to break. Frank stood in the doorway, frozen. He forgot to breathe. Her name, he would learn later, was Delilah Monroe. She had grown up in Memphis, the daughter of a preacher and a seamstress. She had come to Chicago 3 years earlier with dreams of making it big. Instead, she found what most dreamers find: closed doors, empty promises, men who wanted everything except her talent. She sang at the Velvet Door 6 nights a week for tips and whatever the owner, a tired Greek named Stavros, could afford to pay her. Frank watched her finish her set. He watched the sparse crowd applaud politely and return to their drinks. He watched Delilah step off the stage, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. And then he did something impulsive, something that would haunt him for years. He walked up to her table. "You're wasting your voice in this place," Frank said. "No introduction, no charm, just the truth." Delilah looked up at him. She didn't recognize him at first. In the dim light, with his hat pulled low, he could have been anybody. "Excuse me? Your voice? It's a gift, and you're burying it in a tomb." Delilah's eyes narrowed. "Mister, I don't know who you are, but I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." Frank took off his hat. The recognition hit her like a slap. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. "You're—" "Yeah," Frank said, sitting down uninvited. "I'm him. And I'm telling you, you've got something special, something rare, and I want to help you." Over the next week, Frank became obsessed. He returned to the Velvet Door every night, slipping away from his entourage, sitting in the back corner, watching Delilah sing. He sent her flowers. He sent her notes. He offered to introduce her to Capitol Records. He offered to pay for voice lessons, new arrangements, anything she needed. Delilah refused everything. "I don't take charity," she told him on the fourth night, her voice cold. "Especially not from men who want something in return." "I don't want anything," Frank insisted. "I just want to hear you sing on a real stage. I want the world to know your name." "The world doesn't want to know my name, Mr. Sinatra. I'm a colored girl from Memphis. The world wants me to stay invisible." Frank heard something in her voice that night. Not just bitterness, fear. She was afraid of something, or someone. He started asking questions. He talked to Stavros, the club owner. Stavros was nervous, evasive. "She's a good girl," he said. "She just wants to be left alone." "Why?" Frank pressed. Stavros looked around the empty club like the walls had ears. "There are people who have an interest in her. People you don't want to cross. Even you, Mr. Sinatra." Frank didn't push further. But he didn't stop coming back either. On the 10th night, something changed. Delilah finished her set and walked directly to Frank's table. She sat down across from him. Her eyes were red, like she had been crying. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she whispered. "Because you deserve better than this. You don't know what I deserve." "Then tell me." She was silent for a long moment. Then she said something that shattered him. "If you really want to help me, buy this club." Frank blinked. "What?" "Buy it. Stavros wants to sell. He owes money to people. Bad people. If you buy the club, he's free. And maybe I'm free too." Frank didn't understand, but he saw the desperation in her eyes. And Frank Sinatra, the man who had clawed his way back from nothing, could never say no to desperation. "How much?" 3 days later, Frank Sinatra owned the Velvet Door. He paid $20,000 in cash, more than the club was worth. But he didn't care. He had his lawyers draw up papers that gave Delilah full control of the bookings, the music, everything. He told her it was her stage now, her kingdom. The night the deal closed, Frank came to the club for what he thought would be a celebration. The place was empty except for Stavros, who was packing his things with shaking hands and a single lamp burning on the stage. "Where's Delilah?" Frank asked. Stavros wouldn't meet his eyes. "She's gone, Mr. Sinatra." "Gone where?" "Just gone. She left this afternoon. Took her things. Said to tell you thank you." Frank felt the room tilt. "Thank you? That's it? Where did she go?" "I don't know. She didn't say. She was crying. She hugged me. And then she walked out that door." Frank stood in the empty club, surrounded by velvet curtains and a broken piano. And for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. He had bought her freedom, and she had used that freedom to disappear. He spent the next week tearing Chicago apart. He hired private investigators. He called in favors from people who owed him. He learned pieces of the truth, fragments of a story Delilah had never told him. She had been married, years ago back in Memphis, to a man named Curtis Baines. Curtis was connected, not mob-connected, worse. He ran numbers for some very dangerous people on the South Side. When Delilah left him, she didn't just leave. She ran. She hid. She changed her name. She sang in a dying club in a forgotten neighborhood because it was the one place Curtis would never think to look for her. But Curtis had found her anyway. 3 weeks before Frank walked into the velvet door, Curtis had walked in too. He had sat in the back. He had watched her sing. He had smiled that smile she remembered from her nightmares. Frank's money hadn't bought her freedom. It had bought her escape. With Stavros out from under his debts, there was nothing tying her to Chicago anymore. She could finally run again. And this time she had enough cash to disappear for good. Frank sat alone in his hotel suite, holding the telegram, understanding at last. He hadn't saved her. He had just given her the wings to fly away. Frank kept the velvet door. He didn't know what else to do with it. For a few months, he hired other singers, other bands. He tried to turn it into something special, but the magic was gone. The club closed 6 months later. The building was torn down in 1962 to make room for a parking lot. Frank never saw Delilah Monroe again. His investigators tracked her as far as Detroit, then lost the trail. Some said she went to Canada. Some said she went back south. Some said Curtis found her, and the story ended the way those stories always end. But there were other rumors too, whispers that reached Frank years later, carried by musicians who traveled the circuits he never saw. They said there was a woman singing in a church in New Orleans. A woman with a voice like wounded honey. A woman who never gave her real name, but sang like she was praying for forgiveness. They said she had a son. A boy with bright eyes who sat in the front pew every Sunday and watched his mother sing. Frank never went to New Orleans to find out. He told himself it was because he was too busy. The truth was simpler and sadder. He was afraid. Afraid that if he found her, he would discover that his help had done more harm than good. Afraid that his grand gesture had been nothing but ego dressed up as charity. The experience changed something in Frank. He became more cautious with his generosity. He still helped people. He still championed unknown talents. But he learned to ask questions first. He learned that not everyone who needs saving wants to be saved. And he learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is let them go. What happened at the Velvet Door teaches us something Frank Sinatra spent years trying to understand. Mentorship is not ownership. Generosity is not control. When we try to save someone, we have to ask ourselves, are we doing it for them, or are we doing it for ourselves? Frank wanted to be Delilah's hero. He wanted to be the man who discovered her, who lifted her from obscurity, who made her a star. But Delilah didn't need a hero. She needed an escape hatch. And in his own clumsy, generous way, Frank gave her exactly that. The mystery of Delilah Monroe haunted Frank for the rest of his life. He mentioned her once in an interview in the 1970s. The reporter asked about his biggest regret. Frank paused for a long time. Then he said, "I once bought a jazz club for a singer I barely knew. She disappeared the next day. I never found out if I saved her or just made things worse. That question keeps me up at night. There is a lesson here for all of us. We live in a world that celebrates grand gestures. We want to be the person who swoops in and fixes everything. But sometimes the people we're trying to help are fighting battles we can't see. Sometimes our help is just another complication in a life already too complicated. The truest form of generosity might be the hardest one. It's giving someone what they need and then stepping back. It's trusting them to find their own way. It's accepting that you might never know how the story ends. Frank Sinatra bought a rundown jazz club for one unknown singer. She disappeared the next day, and somewhere maybe she's still singing. That has to be enough. This is the story they don't tell you about Frank Sinatra. Not the swagger, not the songs, not the women or the mob connections or the Hollywood glamour. This is the story of a man who tried to do something good and learned that goodness is more complicated than we want it to be. This was Frank Sinatra. Legacy Confidential. If this story made you see Sinatra differently, hit that like button. Share it with someone who believes in the power of a helping hand. And subscribe, because we're just getting started. There are stories about Frank that the history books forgot. Stories about loyalty and betrayal, about love and loss, about the price of fame and the cost of kindness. Leave a comment below. Have you ever tried to help someone who didn't want to be saved? What did it teach you about yourself? I'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember, sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to walk away.